Hey everyone, I just want to let you know really quickly, I'm still trying to connect to Facebook. I'm having a little bit of issue with it. It looks like Facebook is acting up, but I will let you all know once we're connected. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our event, Our Voice, Our Communities, Addressing Local Redistricting. My name is Dr. Deborah Ann Turner, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Today, we will be discussing a critical process that impacts our democracy and how communities are represented, and it's called redistricting. This year, all states will draw new district maps based on the 2020 census population count. And today we will hear what that means, why it matters, and what you can do to ensure your community needs are met. Community districting or redistricting is the process of crafting new districts at the congressional, state, and local levels. How maps are drawn impacts where we can vote and who we can vote for. It also impacts how resources are divided among communities and how our elected representatives will prioritize our needs, The process already up and running and will be in place for a full decade. Therefore, it is critical that we do the right thing this time around. We have been preparing for this moment for years. Through our redistricting reform program, People Powered Fair Maps, the League of Women Voters in all 50 states plus DC has been working to ensure that maps are drawn fairly and transparently and not manipulated by those in power. We have worked to empower everyone to ensure people like you can make your voices and the needs of your community heard. How maps are drawn impacts every issue we care about, which is why it is crucial to use our voices to share with map drawers what's most important for our neighborhoods. Here with us today are league members from Arizona, Kentucky, and Wisconsin to share their on-the-ground experiences, including why they are part of this work, why it matters, and how they are helping make a difference.
I'm Penny Sharon, President-elect of the League of Women Voters of Arizona. In 2000, after organizing and passing a citizen-led ballot initiative, Arizona became the first state to implement an independent redistricting commission to draw our congressional and legislative districts. This means that instead of legislators who are often motivated to draw districts that best protect their re-election odds, we have a process that puts the power of redistricting in the hands of the people. While this has made for more equitable representation at the state and federal level, it has not changed how districts and precincts are drawn at the local level. Arizona counties are responsible for updating voting precincts, justice court precincts, and board of supervisor district boundaries, and cities and municipalities for wards and city districts. These precincts determine representation that impacts us on a daily basis. I live in Maricopa County, the most populous and diverse county in Arizona, and the fastest growing county in the country. This massive population growth means that we will see considerable changes to our voting precincts, our smallest unit of electoral districts. These voting precincts are where communities mobilize and exercise their voting power. This is where kitchen table decisions impacting daily lives are made, such as voting for school district resources, water, public transportation, health and human resources, and who represents the communities on city councils. I care about how our resources are used and if our schools are getting what they need, if our communities have access to clean water, public transportation. And these are the types of things that show up on my ballot. This matters. Where you live, you will be impacted and need to get involved. To have a big impact, remember, all voting is local, so get out there and make yourself heard today at your local redistricting meetings. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Abby Lowry. I am a stay-at-home parent of 2 kids, a former public school teacher, an engaged citizen, and a local elected official in DeForest, Wisconsin. I want to share why I'm fighting for fair maps. DeForest is easy to find on a map, just north of our state capital in Madison with defined municipal borders. DeForest has just over 10,000 people living here, yet we have been carved up into 3 state assembly districts and 3 state senate districts. Instead of dealing with 2 legislators, we have 6. I never considered this an issue until I started paying attention to state issues that impact my community. 5 years ago, I found out that my family and I were living on the boundary between assembly districts. At the time, there was a bill proposed at the state capitol to allow private companies to buy and operate water utilities. I was tuned into the Flint, Michigan water crisis, and with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, I had enough to worry about without having to worry about the quality of their drinking water. I started organizing my neighbors around this issue because I knew they would also be concerned. I hit a roadblock when, in researching our legislators' contact information, I found out that my neighbors across the street were in a different district than me. My own neighbors, with whom I share school district, trash collection, and shop at the same grocery stores, had different representation. To make our voices heard, we had to do 6 times the work to have 1/6 of the impact. New district maps are being worked on right now. Our voice during this process makes a difference to ensure that communities stay together. Make sure your voice is heard.
I'm Sarah Breckwald from the League of Women Voters of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Hopkinsville is unique, from being named Eclipseville during the 2017 solar eclipse to this year's title as Batter Capital of the World for our one-of-a-kind farming and manufacturing partners. We're one of the most racially diverse cities in the state of Kentucky, and the Fort Campbell Army Base brings soldiers and their families here from all over the world. So we have a lot that brings us together. But our representation in the state legislature is divided right now. The heart of our city is split into 3 different districts, so that pieces of our town are added to state representative districts with voters up to 3 whole counties away. Hopkinsville voters share our schools, our local infrastructure, our healthcare system, our local tax structure, and our agricultural partnerships. But there's no district that's empowered to consider or represent those community interests as a whole. Most other comparably sized cities in the state of Kentucky aren't split like we are. So what are we doing about it? Our league here in Hopkinsville has been working on Fair Maps outreach and an effort we're calling Unite Hopkinsville to get the community talking about what are the best lines for Hopkinsville moving forward. This year we met at the local courthouse for the League's Day of Action for Fair Maps. We've done presentations at local community organizations. We've started a letter and email writing campaign to our legislators. We've used social media, newspapers, and radio to connect. We've supported the state's Fair Maps petition, and we're participating in the State League's Fair Maps forums to share information and get feedback from the community. Here in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, the new redistricting maps will stay in place for 10 years. So we have just this one chance to make sure they represent our incredible community. We're doing everything we can to make sure we make a positive difference.
Hello, everyone. I am sorry that I had a technology mishap there, but I'd like to continue on if that is okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. So thanks to our league members for a great jumping off point to dive deeper into the implications of how maps are drawn locally. It's clear that we cannot achieve fair maps alone, which is why we built diverse partnerships on the ground and are active members in a coalition of 9 other organizations to form the Charge Hub, a coalition hub for basically advancing redistricting and grassroots engagement. I am pleased to be joined today by our friends who we are doing this work with. Jamal Watkins, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP. Raymond Partolin, National Field Director with Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, and Sandra Mitrovic, Civic Engagement Associate with the National Congress of American Indians. We will discuss the ongoing map drawing process, then take a few minutes from the audience to please use the Facebook chat to drop your questions. So to get us started, I want us to discuss how we're all connected this to work. As members of national organizations, can each of you tell me why you care about local redistricting? And I'll start with you, Jamal.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Turner, and to the League of Women Voters, our partners. When we think about redistricting from the perspective of the NAACP, 112-year-old community-based institution that's in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, we're rooted in one very simple premise that our vote is our most treasured political capital in this nation, and that in many ways our vote is our voice in order to really normalize and equalize the playing field. And so when we think about the processes that we undergo every 10 years in this nation of doing a census, meaning counting all human beings that live within the borders of this great nation, but then pivoting that to assessing resources where federal dollars go, but also determining the political boundary lines, it is all connected to this simple premise that our voice and our vote are inextricably linked, and that's our biggest political capital. So for the NAACP and for most of our partners in this ecosystem, we understand that at the end of the day, how these lines are drawn has implications on communities being able to select candidates of their choice who will represent them on critical issues like healthcare. Think about the COVID-19 pandemic, education, the economy, the list goes on and on. So when we think about what's happening literally right now in this nation, it's probably the most critical component to elections and political representation for the next 10 years plus, and that is the drawing of these lines. So we take redistricting very seriously and know that it is about individual communities having a voice and being represented in the political ecosystem known as our democracy.
Thank you very much, Jamal. Sandra, why do you care about local redistricting, particularly in relation to what Jamal just said?
Absolutely. So I don't think I could have started off any better, and definitely echo so many of those sentiments. Telling our story, for our Native communities across the country, really ensuring that our voice is a part of this process. Largely, our Native communities have been undercounted. I don't think that's any secret, right? Amongst other communities here have been undercounted in the census. And so when that directly relates to that representation, resource allocation, all the things that Jamal just mentioned, we need to be sure that our voice is part of this story in redistricting. For us, it's definitely twofold, the representation overall, but specifically increasing our Native representation, specifically looking at where we can have a higher probability of electing a Native representative, or a representative that really hears and understands and is willing, right, to go to bat for those resources, those things, the change that we need to see to ensure, as Jamal just mentioned, that those adequate resources in healthcare, we, especially right now, we're seeing that, right? And what that looks like for many of our communities, but also just making sure that those stories are told around the country, and especially in redistricting. I know we're going to get into this in a little bit, talk about some very specific cases, but where we have seen that those voices have been split up, when they've been watered down, when they haven't been adequately represented, what that has meant for our Native communities and other communities across the country.
Thank you, Sandra. Once again, it's incredibly important for us to really understand some of these many and diverse situations that are involved in redistricting. Raymond, what would you like to add to this conversation?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Turner, and thank you to you for moderating this panel, and for the League of Women Voters for setting this up and making this possible. I also want to thank Jamal and Sandra at the NAACP and NCAI, respectively, for being on this panel. I'm just humbled to be in your presence today. The three of you are my movement role models, and I appreciate the opportunity to share in this space with you all. I just want to echo everything that Jamal and Sandra already said. I think they made some really great points. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have historically been left out of decision-making processes that affect our everyday lives. So we at APIA Vote are committed to ensuring that our communities are included in these very important processes. We work with our partners in 28 different states to build capacity and infrastructure to support our community's ability to have a decisive say in elections, not just in 2020, not just in 2021 and 2022, but for years and decades to come. And Dr. Turner, oftentimes people forget about the important role that local elected officials have on our daily lives. When we talk about local elected officials, we're talking about city councils, mayors, boards of commissioners, boards of supervisors, school boards, etc. Federal and state government usually gets all the spotlight in the mainstream and ethnic media, but local government, I would argue, has an even greater impact on people's day-to-day lives than federal and state government. Now, in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the amendment specifically reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." So the very way that our government works confers a number of important powers to local and state government. And on a personal level, I care about local districting because as a person who spent the majority of my life as an undocumented immigrant from the Philippines, I honestly just got tired of elected officials making decisions that affect my life so deeply without me having the opportunity to have a seat at the table. So redistricting gives me and our entire community a voice in a process that has historically left people that look like me and people that look like others on this panel out.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Real critical point for us to think about as we talk about this redistricting issue. So Sandra, I'd like to turn to you with this question. Earlier, we heard Penny, Sarah, and Abby share some questions and some statements. And they said this issue impacts all of us and issues we care about. So when thinking locally, how has your community been impacted by redistricting in the past? And what's really at stake for the future of your community?
So I think, one of the things that we've all kind of talked about, right? Equal representation. That's always at stake for us when we think about, I was looking at some of the percentages of legislators that represented or Native legislators that may be in districts. We are at the lower end of the spectrum. We're growing, as we saw in this last cycle. We have a lot more representation in very wonderful places where we're actually seeing change, and that's been phenomenal. We're also seeing, I think for us, also looking at How does that affect, resource allocation? We talked through that a little bit. Transportation, connectivity, that's a big one across Indian country. Many of our reservation lands, off-reservation lands are in rural communities. And so how we're looking at connectivity, especially in this time, in COVID, where we all had to pivot, where tribal nations had to shut down, which also affected the count, and so that was another opportunity. Voting rights also, we already talked about that in terms of, that adequate opportunity to have our voices heard in elections. What's at stake for us is also being able to not only have access, we always talk a little bit about education and engagement, especially with Native Vote, but also the access. And we know that across our Native communities, that's always been a challenge, having that access to polls. In some communities, people are driving, round trip 2 hours to get to even be able to voice their vote. And that's a challenge we need to make sure that we are addressing. Without a voice in the process, it's extremely difficult to make sure that our community has the needs across the board. And so that's definitely at stake for us. One of the examples today that I wanted to provide, at least so that people have a sense, and this is just one example, but specifically like in South Dakota, when you're thinking about redistricting, leaders have either packed historically Native populations into a single district to reduce that influence, and so when we're thinking about that sense of dilution, what does that mean for people to have their voices heard? And then you see it with resource allocation. So when we're looking at in their 2001 redistricting cycle, they ruled that the South Dakota legislature violated the Voting Rights Act by packing District 27 in South Dakota with 90% of Native American voters, which definitely diluted the potential influence that they could have had in a neighboring district. So when we think about that and thinking about this process today, when we're talking about drawing more fairly districts, we need to consider those states like South Dakota, where we need to make that change. And I know we're going to get into this later, but we'll talk about some of those other examples of states that have really done that, pulled together and gotten either task force or commissions to really plead that case. So definitely, as everyone talked here about what's at stake for the future, all the things that I mentioned, but also really when you think about it, when we have fair and equal representation across the board, our communities are stronger. They're stronger because we're working together to make things better. And so it's one of the areas I also want to stress is that we need to look at it in that way. And hopefully we can do so in this cycle.
Okay, thank you. So Jamal, then kind of building on what Sandra and Raymond have said, so what do fair maps on the local level look like to you? What does that mean and what does it look like?
Well, I would say that, when we think about the process that we undergo, first with the census, which is really, enumerating who are a part of our communities, there is something intrinsic about what Sandra just lifted up that in many ways, communities have been historically undercounted. And so first and foremost is making sure that we have a clear conception and depiction of who resides in local communities. And so once that happens, then the next stage is to really determine what do those communities look like. And what I would argue is that in many ways, inclusive and fair maps is really about identifying communities. And as we know, in several states, state law requires a consideration of, say, communities of interest. And in most other states, there's at least some background brought into play when lines are drawn around communities. Now, in some cases, it's hard for folks to concretely say, well, what is a community? And there is no one roadmap that, redistricting entities can really sort of adopt that says, here's what a community looks like, and it's a one size fit all. And so what we really need is members of local communities to assist in the process of mapping the boundaries that define who they are and really being thoughtful around how do you keep together communities that are similar, that look alike, that think alike, that have similar cultural backgrounds. There's sort of a matrices of considerations that should be brought to bear. And what I would argue and what the NAACP would argue is that in many ways, it's really having a community-centric process. that involves the people who live in a specific geography to actually tell the story of this is our community and how we define it. And it's an iterative process, so not a top-down approach. But we all know that in some states, actually many states, that's not always the case. And there are political forces and parties that are trying to define the political boundary lines based upon other formulas, like staying in power and which party is going to actually win given the likelihood of a composition. So when we think about this notion of fair and inclusive maps, it really is rooted in the fact that you have to have community members centric within the process, central to the process, and engaged in the process to help define what their communities look like, and therefore the political boundary lines that encapsulate those communities.
Great, Jamal. So Raymond, would you like to respond to that too? And share if what Jamal said, does that resonate with you? And do you have anything further to say about that? Because this whole concept of fair maps on the local level is something that I think that we have not really looked at as well as we should in the past.
Absolutely. I think Jamal really hit the nail on the head here. One of the main things that we have to ensure is that our community members are represented in this process, and that our community members are educated, and that they are using their distinct local knowledge about their communities and helping to educate redistricting authorities across the country about where they are and what their shared concerns, what their shared values are as a community. The US Census data tells us that our community is changing rapidly right before our eyes. According to the US Census Bureau, the Asian American population has grown by 38.6% from 2010. The Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community has grown by 29.5% from 2010. And the Asian and Pacific Islander community remains the fastest growing major racial group in the United States. And by comparison, the Hispanic or Latino population grew by 23%, and the Black or African American population grew by 11.7%. Meanwhile, the white population increased by only 1.9%. So again, Dr. Turner, I would emphasize that the racial and ethnic composition of our country is changing before our very eyes, and our governments have to respond. At every level of government, our elected officials must take account of this massive growth of communities of color across the country and redraw district lines accordingly to ensure that our needs are placed front and center and not the needs of incumbent politicians and candidates from the majority political party. So the last thing I'll say about that is, by joining together to demand that we are included in the process of drawing fair districts, we ensure that we have the opportunity to elect leaders who will truly represent us. When these new lines are drawn, they must take into account our community's growth.
Thank you, Raymond. And coming back to you again, Sandra, listening to what Jamal and Raymond has said, and I think Raymond also hit on another point about how the census is going to impact local community redistricting or districting as you look at it. How do you feel about that? And do you see this in the same way that Raymond and Jamal are? Do you see a difference in your communities? Or what do you see as community impact with the census?
Absolutely. So, I love the percentages definitely that Raymond just shared. We saw an 86.5% increase in our American Indian and Alaska Native population. But when you dig into the data, and I know that we have some links that we're going to share with folks, our Policy Research Center at the National Congress of American Indians under Dr. Yvette Rubidoux and Gwen Evans-Lamiesva, they put together several reports. And in those reports, they gave us a brief look at both the increase that I just mentioned, but also they went in and were able to show with every tribe what that increase looked like. In some cases, we saw a decrease in some populations. A lot of that, obviously, we know is due to some effect of COVID. Some of it is due to new privacy measures. And then there's also some that actually were able to get a higher count in 2020. And so I think what we're seeing is a spectrum. I appreciate, that the comments that were just made about seeing a new and diverse community. I think what's crucial about that is I was just on a call the other day talking with a group about the census and how people felt about the participation, the outreach and engagement that we, Raymond just talked about education in our communities and engagement. Some of the things that they said in that group, and this was a group out of Denver and they had different people from different states, Oklahoma, Arizona, and others. They talked through and they said, it's key that this is a day in and day out process. The census isn't something that just happens in a decennial. And I think sometimes we think 10 years, but really what we need to be thinking about is day in and day out. Raymond said it best. Things happen, in Jamal, things happen on a local level. What are we doing day in and day out to ensure that we are seeing that count be accurate? When we think about how are our communities receiving that messaging, in our tribal communities, there's a lot of issue, and I know in all of our communities, there's an issue of trust. When you have people coming into your community that maybe you're not familiar with, and they're trying to also engage in a discussion about filling out this information. And maybe you didn't always see yourself reflected in those numbers or reflected in the resources that then came to your community. Are you likely to fill that out? And so I think in our communities, what we heard a lot is, again, that outreach messaging from trusted messengers and community, ensuring that this is a conversation that continues day in and day out, really relating it to the work that we're doing in our communities, to again, I go back to resources. How is that then translating into our communities? And then also when we think about that, if we're talking about, and somebody said it great in the message the other day, we started off with the message of hard to count. And what somebody said is, no, we need to change that messaging to historically undercounted or historically not represented, right? So we need to change that mindset of hard to reach or hard. We're not. We want to be involved in the process too, but we also need meaningful consultation. We need a side-by-side approach so that we can work together to make it work for our communities. And so that's also something I would love as we start approaching 2030, I want us to see that day in and day out, that commitment, participation, and again, that engagement that really takes into account the messaging that the communities need.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So looking at that, as we talk about redistricting and districting, we sometimes want to pull our hair out or throw our hands up because we think it's that, like you said, it's hard to do and we're not being successful. So I'd like you each to think about activists on the grounds have been working to make sure that lines are drawn fairly and the people, not politicians, influence the map drawing process. So really, what successes have you seen in the effort to achieve fair maps, and have there been any? And I'm going to give you each a chance to weigh in on that concept. So I see you smiling, Sandra, and we'll let you start, and then we'll let Jamal and Raymond jump in and talk about success for a change, because that's what pumps us up.
And I want to say many thanks to Jamal and Raymond. Thank you, Raymond, for your comments earlier. If it wasn't for our groups, League of Women Voters, and all of our partnerships, we wouldn't have been able to be successful in a lot of the messaging that we saw going into the census and in parallel to voting as well. And we saw that carry over into our legislative sessions, right? I saw more testimony this year in a lot of legislative session than I had seen in a while from Native community. And that really just kept me going. So one of the things that we also saw is multiple task force groups and committees around the country working together to achieve fair maps. One great example of this is in New Mexico with an ad hoc redistricting committee. They had submitted proposals for state house and senate districts. They completed that on behalf of the New Mexico 19 Pueblos and the Jicarilla Apache Nation to ensure that Indigenous people in the state continue to maintain both a political voice and ensure some influence. And what they were able to do by doing that is their proposed maps for the 6 House districts in Northwestern New Mexico basically account to maintaining a 60% voting majority. And so when you think about that, and we think about fair maps and in this process of submitting, and I believe over the course they've submitted over 126 maps, I believe, at this point. But when you think about that, and Jamal talked about this, that voice being a part of the process, and all of the pueblos, if you're familiar with New Mexico, the pueblos and everyone is different, right? All of our tribes are unique, distinct, and different sovereign nations. And so when we think about that and having those voices at the table, talking about what their communities look like, their each individual communities coming to the table, ensuring again, that percent that I just kind of mentioned, to be fair across those districts. That's one example of success that I have seen. But we're also seeing more. We're seeing more of those independent committees take into account Native voice. I'd love to see more, especially in those areas where there are rural communities, like South Dakota, like in Montana, where we want to make sure that tribes are receiving, or I should say, in process with consultation on tribal lands, so that they don't have a barrier of trying to get to a meeting that's maybe far away. So I'd like to see a little bit more of that. And again, like I said, that's one example of success, and I hope to hear about more as we move forward into additional testimonies and community building.
Thank you, Sandra. Jamal, have you seen successes?
I would go back to the 2010 redistricting cycle to lift up what I believe is a pattern of success connected to how community mapping is undertaken in certain locations. So I, for example, have the privilege of living in the city of Los Angeles in my adulthood. I live in Washington, D.C. now, but say 20 plus years ago, when the city was led by Mayor Tom Bradley, the demographics of Los Angeles were a little different, and that racial and ethnic minority groups, in terms of the sizes, were different. Today, if you were to look at the data, you see that the African American community in the city of Los Angeles is really the smallest racial and ethnic minority group, if you will, inside of the city. But what we've learned is that in 2010, the city, meaning community groups, leaders, decided to come together and do asset mapping, community mapping, if you will, and really shaping what districts should look like for the city of Los Angeles, but from a community perspective, taking into account demographic shifts, but also taking into account that in some cases, the Latinx community, the Native community in terms of Native Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, there may be a lot of overlap in terms of culture, community, geography, and background. And so what you started to see was the community mapping trend actually in a city like Los Angeles become a thing where individuals said, we're going to draw our maps, we're going to present our maps and push the narrative that shows who we are. And what you end up with is a different process, which is almost bottom up. And I would argue for this cycle, there are other cities and locations who have expanded this notion of let us undertake a community mapping process, like in Houston, Texas. And so when we think about geographies who are wrestling with race, class, migration, immigration, all types of patterns, having community folks say, we're going to sit down and get this right by using technology. I mean, it's incredible to see, hyper-local folks being able to use tools because the technology has evolved. You don't have to be a demographer or a GIS expert to actually play around with some of the free tools like Redistrictar, or you may even decide I'm going to go in the direction and learn Maptitude, and I'm going to learn how to use Esri's ArcGIS. But the fact is that these open source models are allowing for community mapping and community of interest mapping to be scaled up in a way that not only is it permissible inside of the political machinery that happens during the map drawing process, but in cases where we have to go to court and go through litigation, these maps can be used in order to make cases around why certain maps should or should not be, drawn in a certain way. So I would say the success stories is really the democratization of the tools, but also this notion that community mapping is permissible, it can be successful, and it's something that we should be owning in a hyper-local way, and how it rolls up to, the state and the national sort of discussion around redistricting really is a game changer and a sea change given this redistricting cycle.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jamal, for pointing that out. And Raymond, what do you have to say about success?
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Turner. I 100% agree with everything that Sandra and Jamal just mentioned, especially the point about the democratization of the mapping tools that are now available to everyone. It's free, easy to use. We at APIA Vote, we like to demonstrate the use of this tool called Districtor, which Jamal alluded to. It allows for anyone without even registering to hone in on their state, hone in on their city and their neighborhood, and start to map out the boundaries of their community of interest based on their own local and distinct knowledge of their community. You know, this is knowledge that people from outside of the community aren't going to have. This is knowledge that is gained from living in a community, working in a community, and thriving in a community. And these are the things that need to be shared with people who are drawing and approving these district lines, because you know, with the Charge Hub, we host this training called the Redistricting Community College. We've done it several times now, and we talk about the 3 C's of redistricting advocacy: the culture, concerns, and the count. The culture refers to a community's shared history, their shared culture, their shared background. The concerns are, you know, a community's shared concerns, and it could also be examples of instances in which elected officials have in the past ignored or perhaps overlooked the needs of that particular community. And then lastly, we've got the count, which is the data that supports the narrative that we're presenting about a community. And so now we, as Jamal noted, we have these tools that make it easier for us to present these arguments in favor of keeping our communities together. And something Sandra said earlier really stuck out to me, which is the importance of working in coalition, the importance of these partnerships. You know, APIA Vote is so fortunate and so thankful to be in partnership with the League of Women Voters and NAACP and CAI and the other members of the redistricting coalitions around the country, because together our collective efforts are ultimately going to take us across the finish line and are ultimately going to allow us to ensure that district lines are drawn in a way that takes our community's needs into account. So the last thing I'll say is I just want to share one local example of a success story from the 2010 redistricting cycle. And I want to give a special shout out to our friends at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus for providing us with this example. But there's this community in San Jose, California. It's called Berryessa. It's not a huge community. It's got about 40,000 people. And in the 2001 redistricting cycle, this community was split among 4 different assembly districts, despite the fact that this community in Berryessa in the city of San Jose, California, had shared interests, shared concerns. And over half of that community's population was API. So one can imagine that a neighborhood of about 40,000 people would be able to garner much more responsiveness if they were able to target their efforts to one elected official as opposed to being divided among 4 different offices. So remember, after this map was established in 2001, they had to live with 10 years of this, because again, redistricting only happens every 10 years, which is why we have to get it right now. So in 2011, the community of Berryessa advocated for their neighborhood to be kept intact, and redistricting authorities listened. And now the community of Berryessa is now contained within this district, and now they have the ability to receive representation from their assembly member, because now they are more accountable to the people in this neighborhood. And so the fact of the matter, Dr. Turner, is redistricting is important. And it's important for our communities to engage, and it's important for us to ensure that we are not left out of this process.
So thank you. Thank you very much, Jamal, Sandra, and Raymond. Your thoughts, your ideas, your consideration, your knowledge has been really incredible today, and I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. During this time, we have been collecting some questions from our audience, and we want to now pose a couple of questions to all of you that have come from the audience. First question here states, Sandra talked about how a Native community was packed into a district to minimize their representation power. I also heard someone talk about their neighborhood needs being diluted across 6 legislators, just as you spoke about. How do we know when and where to consolidate or where to spread out the representation to best reflect all needs? So the question is not only the importance of consolidation or dispersion, but how does the everyday person figure out when to attack this, how to attack this, and how they should do it? Comments from any of you who would like to start?
I'm happy to lean in, Dr. Turner, and I
Great.
know Sandra and Raymond can sort of round this out. But as we overemphasize the importance of community engagement and community involvement, we recognize that community members and volunteers and stakeholders should not be left alone to have to sort out redistricting. So there's a broader ecosystem that requires folks that are demographers, so experts in the space, political scientists who may be rooted in the community and understand some of the data points, and actually lawyers. I know that for some of us, we love lawyers. Some of us were like, okay, here they come. But we realize that when you have a broader ecosystem or a team within a community, data scientists, political scientists, lawyers, along with community members could potentially have prevented the example that Raymond lifted up of Berryessa from being literally cracked apart for 10 years, because they could say, wait a minute, the data is showing this community has shared interests, shared needs. And if you were to draw them into 4 different districts, it dilutes their ability to stay together as a community, to achieve the ability to select candidates of their choice and to meet their needs. So I would argue part of why we are in this type of partnership is that you need organizations alongside community members, alongside volunteers, alongside lawyers, all working together to really make sure that we're monitoring and defining what communities should look like. Now that work is a little bit, scary for some. My mother, for example, understands redistricting, but she's not a litigator. But she knows that if she works with her local NAACP or her local, League of Women Voters, that there are others inside of that ecosystem who are paying attention and leaning in to say, let's think about how the numbers play out so that if the maps are drawn in this way, what are the potential negative externalities, the potential harms? And we all know the Voting Rights Act gets kicked into play to help govern this process. And so it's why I would argue having an ecosystem of lawyers, demographers, thought leaders, and community folk, average everyday folk who are not experts in this, but understand their community all together so that you can make sure that the situation like that occurred in Berryessa in 2001 actually is prevented. And so we don't have to suffer for 10 years to fix a wrong. We're actually doing it up front.
Thank you, Jamal. Raymond or Ishana, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I would just follow up. I think the point about organizations is key. So one of the things I know we do with the Charge Hub with all of our organizations is we try to be a great liaison, right, in a network, not only to outline, know the process in your state. Part of it is just, looking at your state and seeing what that process looks like. Right now, you can go even with the Charge Hub and other organizations that have posted some state timelines where they are still collecting testimony, where they are asking for public comment, those kinds of things. And I know public comment, Jamal said that word scary. It can be scary with the first time you're providing testimony, you're even talking through that process. But the Charge Hub has done several trainings on how to provide testimony, what that does that look like, what can you possibly say about your community. We've outlined, Raymond just outlined again, those 3 C's and what that looks like. So being aware of the process in your state, also just preparing yourself to tell your story. We talked about a little of those things today. What matters to you? What is so essential to you that you need to get out there? Sometimes it's just sharing that with someone else that they can uplift. The other part I would say is know the organizations in your state. Jamal just mentioned several of them. You see a lot of us here on the call, National Congress of American Indians. That's our job too, is to support across the country, our Native people across the country, our American Indian, Alaska Native tribes, tribal organizations. We also have different tribal organizations across the state. I mentioned a little bit ago, South Dakota, we have four directions it's working on in partnership with our Native American Rights Fund, who also has really wonderful toolkits out about redistricting. when you're thinking through, as Jamal mentioned, litigation and lawyers, there's a lot of organizations that you can reach out to in your own respective area. And if at any time you're not sure who to reach out to, I think anyone on this panel would be more than happy to help connect you to the right places and spaces. So you're not alone. I think that's the first thing that we're all saying. You're not alone. But two, more than not being alone, we need your voice, because your voice is what's going to help us carry this through and to ensure that we're committed throughout this process. So reach out, don't be afraid. You got to start there. And I think that we can help one another stay strong throughout this cycle.
Raymond, anything to add on that? When to start, how to start, and who to do it with?
Sure. I think that if folks attending this panel today leave with nothing else, they should leave with the idea that voters should pick their leaders, not the other way around. I've actually been following the Facebook chat. There's a really great discussion happening in the chat right now about gerrymandering and how Americans are gerrymandered into districts to enable politicians to choose their voters, not voters choosing their public servants. Christine Adams says, we need to understand that we are being manipulated on a large scale in order to control how and if our votes matter. I think that's a really great point, Christine. Thank you so much for raising that. I don't know if folks have been following what's going on in Ohio right now, but in Ohio, in 2015 and in 2018, Ohio voters strongly supported constitutional amendments designed to curtail gerrymandering by establishing a bipartisan redistricting commission. But just a few weeks ago, the commission, which is controlled 5-2 by Republicans, just approved state legislative maps that would include super majorities of districts favoring the GOP. According to an analysis by the Washington Post, about 70% of state Senate seats and at least 62% of state House seats would favor Republicans, despite the state's voters generally giving Republicans only about 54% of the vote. And so the members of the Redistricting Commission in Ohio say that the maps are justified because Republicans win statewide a lot more than that. According to their statement, when considering the results of each of the 16 statewide elections over the last decade, the commission determined that Republican candidates won 13 out of 16 of those elections, resulting in a statewide proportion of voters favoring statewide Republican candidates of 81%. And so basically what they are saying is that because Republicans win 81% of statewide office in Ohio over the last 10 years, that means that Republicans could be entitled to up to 81% of state legislative districts in the state. And so there are a number of organizations in Ohio challenging these proposed maps. And I mentioned this because Jamal brought up a really good point earlier about litigation. You know, it doesn't stop at community testimony. It doesn't stop at map drawing and community input. Whenever our rights are being violated, whenever there are clear violations of state or federal law, we have avenues to challenge these maps. And so organizations in Ohio are currently litigating, and when we're organizing our community to participate in this process, we want folks to testify. We want folks to submit written testimony, submit maps, because at the end of the day, we're also establishing a record. It's important to have a record when you're filing litigation, when you're filing lawsuits. And it's important that we be a part of those processes. So going back to what Jamal noted, and this is the last thing I'll say, because I recognize that I talk a lot. Everyone has a role in redistricting. Lawyers have a role. Your average community members and neighbors have a role. People have knowledge that they can contribute to the process, and I would encourage everyone to be a part of it.
Okay, thank you very much to this amazing panel with so much great information for us and really some thought-provoking things and ways for us to move forward. We are approaching our final time here, but I have one really quick last question I want you each to use to answer very briefly. And it's simply, what can I do to get involved or ensure that the maps are fair. And I'm going to each a shot, give our audience one thing they can do to make sure this happens. I'm going to start with you, Jamal.
Thank you, Dr. Turner, to the League, NAACP, our partners, Raymond, Sandra. We understand that that's a really critical question. Outside of identifying communities, demanding hearings, showing community maps, educating the media, I would say the biggest thing individuals can do is ask questions. And what Raymond just lifted up in Ohio, for example, asking the questions around what type of data was used to come to these conclusions, and is that the right type of data set? So input, questions about transparency, who are the decision makers, who's drawing the maps, how will they be affected? Questions around the composition of redistricting bodies and the results, questioning whether or not sizable minority communities will be cracked or packed. If we ask the tough questions, the critical questions, it pushes the envelope and actually opens the door for, I would call, fair and inclusive maps to be drawn, whether we get it done during the drawing process or we get it done in a different way through litigation, but ask the tough questions and continue to push the envelope to make sure that maps are drawn in a way that represents the communities we all live in.
Thank you, Jamal. Sandra, what's your one thing you could tell an individual to do?
I really liked what Jamal said about ask the tough questions. I also think through that about accountability. So yes, definitely we need to ask the tough questions and hold people accountable, right? If we have elected officials, hold people accountable, but we also need to hold ourselves accountable. I will also say that in our communities. Also, we have that sense of responsibility within ourselves to tell our story. I really appreciate the comment that Raymond made about build the public record. That is one of the things that we can do so much for ourselves, is to build that public record. So providing our words, our testimony, written or verbal, going and participating, we are the ones that know our story best. And we have to be willing to get out there and to voice that, so that if anything else, people understand where we stand. And ways that we can do that are both, as we mentioned, going to some of those hearings, going to some of those meetings, but just making sure that we're taking note in building that public record, because it will be useful for so many things to come in this work. So again, I'll stay with that, build the public record, get your voice out there, don't be afraid, and reach out to one another. And again, in partnership, we can build such a strong voice in our communities together.
Okay, thank you. And Raymond, I'll give you one last comment on what's the thing you would tell someone to do, the one thing you would tell them that would be critical for them to get involved.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. I think that everyone should stay up to date on what's going on in the redistricting space. Jamal, Sandra, the other members of the Charge Coalition working on redistricting are working day in and day out to ensure that our communities are a part of this process. And so the easiest way to hear from us and to get in touch with us is if you visit redistrictingcommunitycollege.com. There are instructions on the website for where you can join the mailing list and the newsletter. The team does a really great job of updating folks on a weekly basis about what's going on in the redistricting space and how people can get involved. There are a number of trainings that are happening now and over the next couple of weeks. Recordings of previous trainings are available on the website. Again, that is redistrictingcommunitycollege.com. From an APIA Vote perspective, we are going into different states and leading API-specific and state-specific redistricting trainings for members of our community who are interested in getting involved with the redistricting process. This Saturday, we're going to be in the state of Nevada in person, actually, because it is preceding the National Immigrant Integration Conference. And then the week of October 11th, we're leading trainings in New Jersey and in North Carolina. So there are a ton of ways to get involved. Attend a training, be prepared to share your story, draw maps of your community using one of these free mapping tools that we've covered a couple of times during this panel. But more than anything, just be engaged. You know, the fact that you all are here at this panel shows that you are interested in ensuring that our communities are heard, and just keep that going until we get the fair maps and fair districts that we are trying so hard to achieve.
Thank you all. Until success is what I would like to say, Raven. So thank you all for joining us for this important conversation and for being part of the fight for fair maps. Race, party affiliation, or zip code should not determine how our voices are heard in our democracy. Whether this is something that is new to you or something that you've been fighting for alongside us, it is clear that we all have a role to play to ensure we have fair maps. Redistricting is under the way, but it is not too late to get involved. Make the commitment now. Commit to making your voice heard. Commit to protecting your community and community interests. Commit to fighting against voter suppression. Using the link dropped in the Facebook chat, join the People Powered Fair Maps outreach circle for information from us, the League of Women Voters, and our partners, so we can stay involved and you can stay involved. From educating your own networks, gaining skills and information about your local processes, to commenting on proposed maps, as League members Penny, Sarah, and Abby demonstrated earlier, no matter where you are, there is a role for you. We look forward to having you in the fight with us. Once again, thank you to all for joining us, and thank you to our amazing panel for sharing their great insights with us today. Onwards and upwards and success. We will prevail. Good day.